Hello. Yes, hello everyone and welcome to the show. Today's guest is called, his pseudonym, his pen name is Corporate Clarke. His real name is Clarke. And he's from England again. I like my English authors. We don't know much about him. His own bio is very short indeed. It says Corporate Clarke writes edgy genre fiction in his spare time. So maybe you can embellish on that a little bit, Corporate Clarke, and tell us where you're from, what you're all about, and your background and so on.
Yeah, so I write pseudonymously, but mainly that is because I have this, Corporate Clarke is a bit of a joke. It came from some friends because I have this fairly successful corporate career. And obviously just writing is on the side. I'm an independent writer. That's just a side thing. And my friends, you might not consider this from my writing, but my friends consider me like quite clean cut, quite corporate. So, you know, they came up with a bit of a joke calling me Corporate Clarke, that I'm a bit oversensitive to things, etc. So that's how that started. But I only write pseudonymously, really. I don't think I've written or said anything particularly spicy, really. But it's more really to do with just keeping it separate. So just for convenience, really, because I am fairly successful within my career. And if someone was searching under my real name, just don't want to get the two things muddled up. But vice versa, there may be people who have read my book and think I'm some sort of, dissident edgelord from like my sort of Twitter identity, and would be utterly disappointed to find out I am a corporate cog. So
Yeah,
it's really a matter of just keeping those two identities separate for branding purposes, really. Not really afraid of showing my face or, you know, putting my identity behind the things I've said.
it makes perfect sense, and I think it also, you just raised an interesting point, that the overlap now between a fairly normal person and an edgelord is blurring. I mean, you can have. It used to be perhaps that it was the extremists on the far right or something, but the left has moved so far in their direction that we've been dragged along together, and normal people now are considered to be edgy, and you can't even say simple things without being accused of something or other.
In some spaces that's true, but then, you know, there's the meme online of go outside and touch grass, and I try. You see the sort of worst of it online, and then you try to have conversations with real people, real people who I work with, boomers and Gen Xers, and they'll say things, and I'll say to them at work, aren't you worried about what people will think if you say that? You know, things that only 5 years ago I would have thought are totally inane, and they just don't get it. They don't get it. So I think when you do go out and touch grass, I still think there's a lot of regular people out there. Yeah.
Now, the fact that you've taken this name, Corporate Clarke, it's suggested to me that, and the book, I should mention, is called House Anon, a Novella, is set in the corporate world. Do you see this as something of a niche for you, or is the name, as you put it, just this sort of a joke between your mates? Or do you see yourself as a spokesperson, if you like, for the dissident corporate man that's going mad in the current world?
I would say that a lot of, I mean, I tend to write what I know, and I have this sort of, I mean, we'll get into my style, but I do pick the style I write in is a sort of auto-fiction style, even though I'm not writing auto-fiction. I try to get that very conversational, it's just a guy going through his day. And so I think I just naturally fall into the things I know, although my stories aren't autobiographical. I am bringing in the things that I see from day to day into that. And so, yeah, um, that's a long-winded way of saying yes in a manner of speaking, and I think my new the new novella I'm working on at the moment is a similar sort of guy, a sort of middle class guy who's sort of moderate, he's a professional type, moderately successful, but I'm interested in the ruts, the spiritual ruts that those sort of moderately successful people find themselves in, because that's a challenge that I face in my daily life. I've been moderately successful in my life, and it's trying to find sort of meaning in that life when your material needs, you live in like a certain degree of material comfort, and you're trying to find some meaning.
That sounds all very almost Marxist in the sense of alienation in the modern world, and harking back to others of that ilk, Weber and stuff. Are you aware of the sort of context of that kind of context that could be applied to your situation? That the modern world is. I'm sure you are aware of it, but how would you develop that?
Let's take. I think that's becoming more and more a concern. The sort of spiritual needs of someone is becoming more and more a concern of the right. And you're correct that originally I think it did come from, the left. That was a concern of the left, and the left used to be championing the working man. Not so sure big part. I mean, there is still the old-fashioned left around who are doing that, but big parts of the left now are not doing that anymore, and they're not sticking up for the working man. And the new working man is sort of the call center man, or the sort of the professional class who have sort of got into that rut, like I was saying. And I think of a film and a book like Fight Club. And I remember when Fight Club came out, and it being a darling of left-wing sort of academic thought, academic study, and the left were loving Fight Club, and they saw it as a sort of anti-right-wing book and film. And now that's totally reversed, it seems. If you look at Twitter, you look at the discussions online, that a lot of people on the right of centre identify with that spiritual emptiness and that search for meaning once you get past material comfort. And I think maybe Marxism was more about people who didn't have material comfort, and the old left was more about making sure the people who were, truly living hand to mouth could get material comfort.
Very well put.
So I think it's slightly different there. Yeah.
Yes. Do you have a politics background? Did you do a degree in politics or something like that? You sound like you did.
No, my degree's in film studies, and that's my only formal training in writing is sort of kind of script writing, but not much of that. A little bit of storyboarding and stuff like that. I'm an armchair politician. I'm not formally trained in it, but I've done a lot of reading, and in my late teens and early 20s, got very interested in politics. Read Atlas Shrugged at 17 and went through the whole kind of Ayn Rand phase. But
me too. Don't worry.
Yeah, although I still think she is an incredibly smart woman who has a lot of insight. I would say my ideas have moved on a little bit from there.
Yes, yeah. I would echo that entirely. And I'm continually surprised by how brilliant she was in certain areas, but I'm also surprised how less than brilliant she was in other areas. But
yes.
She certainly has served as a good catalyst for a lot of us, I think, to take up
And I guess now, if I was going to describe my beliefs, for a long time, I just described myself as just a classical liberal, like an old-fashioned classical liberal, someone who thinks the state should be as small as reasonably possible. People should be left to their own devices. That sort of classical liberal, right of centre conservative. But since the whole sort of COVID thing, since the lockdowns, I've been thinking a lot of whether, because it felt as if, you know, the classical liberals who were protesting against the lockdowns, they didn't have the ammunition, or maybe they had the intellectual ammunition, but they didn't have the effectiveness to counter what was happening. And so I find myself kind of, although intellectually I would still call myself, you know, a classical liberal, if you asked me to like spell out my political beliefs, I think I find myself kind of sympathizing more and more sort of emotionally with the populists and some of the populist movements we've seen.
Yes, I think that's the process we're all going through. We find allies in the strangest of places now. And also we find enemies popping up in the strangest, you know, people you've really given your trust to unequivocally are the ones more likely now than ever to be the ones who will abuse that privilege. Yes,
because I think classical liberalism suffers a bit, and these sort of like old-fashioned sort of individualist positions on the centre right, they're just not as effective. And some of the populist movements have been very effective, particularly in getting like particular policies through, like, you know, for example, getting the UK to leave the EU, things like that. And that tactic of populism can be very effective in creating alliances.
Yeah.
You know, in Britain, you've seen in the last election anyway, things have got a lot messed up since then, but you saw that the Conservatives were able to form like new alliances in sort of the northern working class areas of Britain, and they're just effective. They're just politically effective in a way that, I don't know if classical liberals ever were, but they're certainly not now.
Well, I think they're scared of the populist movement because it's a beast they know that they won't be able to control. So both sides are supplied to, left and right. The right, in a way, should get over that and get on with it, because populism is really their best hope, and their policies generally, you know, meet the approval of the masses. If they're only, you know, one thinks of the immigration problem, death penalty, and so on. We know that the masses would love this, the Conservatives say, to accept these policies and maybe vote winner left, right, and centre. But I think they're scared, because once it starts, once the people feel their power and flex their muscles and start getting their way, these guys know that their lifespan will shorten dramatically, and so it's like a monster that they don't let out of its cage. Well, it's very interesting views. Go on. Sorry, go on.
I was going to say, and it feels like a new line, a sort of new battleground is being drawn, and you know, I am quite wonkish when it comes to politics, to a fault. Like I can, and in, you know, I've just got tired of it, to be honest. But in the past, I would talk to people about the benefits of marginally decreasing corporation tax, or you know, the benefits of a sales tax over an income tax, or blah blah blah. But it seems now that like the more interesting battleground is a sort of and you know, we're saying the word populist, and I don't consider that a dirty word. I just consider it kind of ideas that are popular and have a sort of grassroots democratic support. And it seems that it's a sort of a populist or a democratic grassroots position versus a technocratic position is where it feels like things are going now. And
yes,
yeah, like you said, that you know, I'm finding, like you said, the Overton window is moving so much that people who I used to consider like, you know, on the soft left, people like Ricky Gervais, or even people like Russell Brand, who I think, you know, if we wrote down our political positions, there's probably not much that I agree with him on, but he does believe in democracy and listening to what people want, and he is suspicious of technocracy, and he and like people like Ricky Gervais and others have been lumped in with this sort of umbrella of, oh, they're not on our new progressive left, so they're the enemy. And they're all in the same bucket with classical liberals, with sort of, you know, national populists, with traditional social conservatives and everyone else. And that's where it feels like the new sort of political coalitions. And I'm not sure where it's going, but I'm just sort of observing it.
Well, that brings me nicely onto the book, which is, I want to stress, an excellent book. Well done, brilliant. At first attempt up, I think pretty much your first attempt at a long form fiction. And it does exactly what we need people to be doing. If they're setting out to write a book and listening to this show, it puts us into this square into this modern world. That's a scenario which we're all familiar with, and it is a sort of bane of most people's lives. And you are in a great position there, in the middle of it, to exploit and, in some cases, ridicule, but definitely reveal the sort of inner illogic or inner irrationality to the whole of modern life, really. And you do it very cleverly. And you're in your 30s, aren't you?
Yeah, late 30s.
Late 30s. Well, that comes across. Well, my late 50s. Yeah. And although I'm keen on the internet and I follow Twitter and stuff, I'm not an expert, but I do know the way you present from the first lines. It's very clear that this is your immediate world that you're describing. You're very familiar with it, and you know it much better than people like I would. It starts, I will just point out, well, first of all, it's dedicated to all the anons, which I thought was terrific.
Yeah.
All the internet anons, it says. Very generous of you, and very good. So people already get, from those 2 words, 3 or 4 words, people immediately get a grasp of where you're coming from. And then the next few lines are it's the typical extract from a Reddit or chat, or one of the 4chans, is it?
Yeah.
Where you have the greater than sign, and then it says "be me" greater than, and it goes on 42-year-old black male anon empath. And so again, using a modern technique, you put us right into the driving seat of where we are and where we're going in only a few words. Very, very clever, and I liked it because there's an immediateness and a connection with our modern means of communications, our modern world, and all the implications thereof. And then what follows is a strange, I would say, mixture of some politics, very succinctly put and cleverly put, but also a kind of ghost story stroke fantasy. How would you describe the sort of genre that you're writing in?
So it's supernatural horror, and
okay.
It's supernatural horror or kind of soft sci-fi. So soft sci-fi in the fact that he is an empath, so he's got this sort of power which he can you know, for want of a better word, sounds a bit corny and sort of dark fantasy, but he can sort of read people's emotions. He has this sort of intuitive way to read and perhaps even influence to some degree people's emotions. So he's an empath, and yeah, so it's soft sci-fi, supernatural horror, and essentially at its core, it is a haunted house story.
Yes.
So
yes.
you know, and as you can imagine, it's very influenced, as you probably see by reading it. It's very heavily influenced by The Shining. The sort of empathic ability is somewhat similar to The Shining ability, but I'd been reading a lot of haunted house sort of stuff, or sort of interacting with a lot of haunted house stuff, and I'd like those type of films, and I just wanted to sort of write something. What would a haunted house story be like today? What would The Shining be like today? So that's just from a plot point of view, that's what it is. And this man gets dragged into a sort of away weekend with his company, and the horror is
they call it corporate bonding or something, don't they?
Yes, yeah, the corporate team building weekend away. And the horror is twofold. There's the sort of the house is genuinely haunted. So there's that he's having to deal with, and his empathic ability, like within The Shining, allows him to sort of see the sort of haunted, the sort of presence at the house more than the other characters in the book. But there's also the sort of more ironic horror on top of it of he's having to go through the diversity, inclusion, and equality sort of training session, and this is caught him completely off guard. And at the beginning of the book, he sort of gets caught off guard. He forgets this weekend's happening. He forgets it's in his diary. He forgets that, you know, the whole corporate bonding thing, like the families have been invited and stuff, and his personal life's in a bit of a mess. Like there's a suggestion that his empathic ability sort of means that he can't properly connect with people because like he can sort of understand them too well in a way, and he you know, he's got an estranged mother of his children. He gets on well with his daughter, but not so well with his son. And he's supposed to be having his children over the weekend. His new girlfriend's there who he hasn't introduced to his children, and he sort of gets dragged into this weekend without his knowledge with his sort of, you know, fairly new girlfriend, and he's sort of trying to deal with these personal issues, deal with the genuine like supernatural presence at this house, and sort of navigate this overlapping diversity training event he's trying to push himself through at the same time. And the main character is a black man. He's not a particularly political person, and he doesn't want to get dragged into a political situation. He's just not very strongly opinionated on those things. And he's shocked that this modern company is doing this training because he's one of the few sort of non-white people at this company. And he's sat there going, you know, for whose benefit is this? And he finds that the sort of more, because it's sort of like a tech startup he's found himself in, and he's a little bit older than everyone else there. He finds that the sort of HR of the company are trying to sort of portray him as a victim, and he just doesn't recognize that. He's a sort of late Gen Xer, early millennial. I sort of pictured him as sort of a son of the Windrush generation, you know, raised with those sort of. He feels very British. He feels very included. He's not concerned about these issues, and he's being forced to deal with them. And it's the sort of what I was trying to explore is the sort of bigotry of victimhood.
Yeah.
So they sort of expect him to be a victim.
Yeah, it's an abusive relationship ultimately, where the one person seeks virtue and authority and self-justification over other people, even though it may well destroy those other people. It's almost like a case of this Munchausen's by proxy, where a mother pretends the child's dying of cancer, even though it isn't, just to look like the heroine that's looking after the child. It's a very deeply sick mental issue. There's a great little quote. I mean, I've got to say, anyone read this, you'll love it if this is your kind of, if you like this exploration of the modern nonsense that we live through. The sections, especially on the diversity training and the nonsense that it is, are excellent. There's some great interactions, but I've only chosen a small quote from it to give people an idea. This is the lead character, 42-year-old black male and non-speaking. The training continues and we learn more about the power structures which make all white people racist. We learn more about white fragility, the way white people are apparently unable to talk about racism, despite them being the people who never seem to shut up about it. We learn about the difference between non-racist and anti-racism. But I must have missed something, because anti-racism sounds like racism to me. Some of my colleagues ask questions, but only clarifications and complimentary anecdotes. Nobody challenges anything they've heard. I mean, that simple paragraph speaks volumes of the quality of your writing. Well done. But it's also amusing. It hits the nail on the head, and so true. Is that more or less extracted word for word from real life scenarios you've been in?
I was just going to mention, just in case anybody from my employment is watching this, I'm very fortunate that I don't work in an environment where this has gone too far. This is sort of but these are what I've heard from other people, other anons and friends online, including, I hate this term, but ethnic minority friends who have sort of been through these situations. So it is based on reality, but it's not my reality. And I'm fortunate enough to work in an environment that's much more sensible than that.
Okay. The genre that you've described, soft, I don't think it's horror as such. I think it's more towards the haunted house story and soft science, fantasy, whatever you call it. It's not my speciality, so I do feel a little bit blind in this world. But there's lots of symbolism, it seems to me, in the book. The deer being, and without giving too much away about the plot and where we're going with it, can you, maybe Christian symbolism, I don't know, but could you explore that a bit?
So, yes, so the big symbolism in it is that the diversity, inclusion, and equity, which gets abbreviated to DIE, and then the event becomes Die in the Workplace, which is sort of a horror thing. But then there's that layered over the real ghosts who are there, and the real ghosts come from a time of, when there was real slavery and real oppression. And, it's implied that the owners of this old country house that's now been converted into a hotel or whatever were slave owners, and there were really slaves there. And the major symbolism there is that they were sort of looking down and treating the black people of the time in that sort of that they were victimizing them, and then the modern sort of anti-racism is also telling them they're a victim and they can't do anything about it, and that this is their fate. And both of the ideologies, although on the surface they're supposed to be opposite to each other, they're both basically saying, no, you don't have control over your fate because of what your history is, and and where you come from. And so that's the major symbolism, that these two ideas have this core similarity, and that they're overlapping each other, and it's sort of creating this vortex which is dragging this guy, and he can sense it through his empathic ability, and he's getting dragged into this, and there's some sort of cosmic or psychic event happening at this moment, at this time, because of these two overlapping ideologies. The symbolism, like there is a lot of Christian symbolism in there, and that's a lot of that reflects. This is where sort of my own imagery was, my own sort of considerations were coming into this. Like, I have been like exploring my own spirituality, and I went to a sort of Church of England school when I was younger, then fell away from that, and I find a lot of the sort of echoes of that coming back to me in recent times, and a lot of that was just an honest exploration of that. So in a lot of the green text, which I sort of, as the story moves on, the green text becomes almost like a prayer, almost like a hymn book. In different, I'm bringing in bits of like quotes from the King James Bible and stuff into the green text, but overlapping that with sort of modern interests and the modern sort of priesthood. So Anon, the main character, is also kind of he's quite online. He's not very political, but he's quite online. He's sort of on the edge of the manosphere, on the edge of the sort of fitness and self-improvement sphere. So he sort of the sort of references to Tim Ferriss, references to Joe Rogan, and you know, when he eats carbs, he sort of asks Tim Ferriss to forgive him. And so it's sort of just overlapping this sort of traditional spirituality and this sort of traditional way of improving your character and sort of being pious with the new sort of self-improvement priesthood and ideology, and sort of wrapping that all together in just an honest exploration from my point of view of how these ideas sometimes rub up against each other, how they sometimes complement each other. And the green text becomes almost like his internal sort of like prayer that he's letting off, that he's speaking directly to the reader in a sort of non-narrative, just bang.
It's almost become a modern substitute for the confession, it almost. Yeah, I mean, that would be it, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Two quick little extracts I'm going to read that reflect this concern of the lead character and you, obviously, of the sort of health, masculinity movement of the day. It's clever how you I mean, this is a scene from the breakfast in the hotel, but cleverly you intertwine the themes. So here's the first one. His son, who's a bit of he's a hopeless lost cause, isn't he? His son, Kanu, heading in the completely wrong direction in life.
Yeah. So I'll just briefly expand on that, if that's okay. So his son has been sort of dragged into the furry world. So he's sort of been dragged into this sort of cartoonish furry world, and he's sort of been pulled in by the sort of more effeminate influences of the internet. So, and his father's struggling to relate to him, but yeah, I'll let you then introduce.
Yes, well, Kanu, this lost cause furry, is inspecting the cereal trolley. He ignores the bran flakes, the shredded wheat, the cornflakes. He picks toxic cereal hoops and spongy neon candy pieces scattered through with spongy neon candy pieces scattered through them like diabetic landmines. He interrogates the milk and picks a carton of something non-dairy. Soybean husks pulped into ersatz cream, then mixed with water and sugar. No flesh, deathless, self-righteous. Adding sugar, blunting the jaws of young men, soiling their metabolism, feminizing them. No, emasculating them. Sugar destroys the feminine too, turning curves of fertility into rolls of obesity, destabilizing hormones and scorching wombs. I mean, this is good stuff, mate. I don't know what you were taking or drinking when you did that, but and very quickly, this is not political, but it just gives you an idea of your brains at work and the quality of the writing. He goes to one of these very complex toasters in the hotel buffet, and he grabs a couple of slices of sourdough, and I put them into one of those toasters that looks like a miniature reversed ski lift through hell. And then he goes on about, there's a whole paragraph on that ski lift through hell. But yeah, brilliant stuff. So tell me, where along the line did you become radicalized and this extremist that has to...
Well, yeah, you know, like I said, I still consider myself
wonderfulness of diversity, inclusiveness, and equity, or whatever. What happened to you?
I still consider myself, you know, a fairly dull, wonkish, classical liberal who would rather be talking about the optimal tax rate than worrying about this stuff. But you know, it's and my mate jokes that. That I'm a boomer con, which I kind of am, just, you know, traditional boomer conservative style. But yeah, when was I red pilled? Well, I've always been on the right of centre, and you know, when I went to university, I was in, you know, a minority of a political opinion there. Most of my friends were, you know, centre to left of centre, and even some like you know, some like radical left wingers, but that's honestly, that's never bothered me, and I've always had like friends across the political spectrum. And so we'll get back to that actually, because that's maybe a bit of an interesting aside. But I've never really sort of had the red pill moment. Like I said, I've always been on the right. It's moved around. Like I said, I used to be a bit of a libertarian. I've even flirted with like anarcho-capitalism, but generally just ended up back in a sort of just a classic small state conservative.
Yeah, nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. And so I've never really had that moment, but it's been interesting that it sort of has become a thing to have that moment. And yeah, this whole phenomenon. But, you know, I went to university, and even though I was in a minority in terms of my, you know, just extremely normal and mainstream conservative beliefs, I was definitely in a minority at university. But nobody had a problem with it. It was like we'd have like a discussion about politics. I'd be in the minority most of the time, and then we'd go out and have some drinks, and just nobody would have a problem with it. You wouldn't get excluded from anything. You wouldn't be caught, you know, told that you were harming people or hurting people with your words. And you know, one of my best.
Sorry, this is 20 years ago we're talking about, basically, or just
Yeah.
Okay. So
and you know, one of my best friends, when I met him at the time, he was basically some sort of, you know, anarcho-syndicalist, environmentalist type. And you know, we almost disagreed about everything, but then we'd spend the whole night like watching film together, slinging back beers.
At some point, would put in their head.
At some point, it became, it became an identity. Not just a belief that people would change and evolve and listen to each other. It's become something crazy. And like, if you have the wrong opinion, you're literally hurting people and putting their, you know, putting their lives at risk, people claim, and stuff.
Yeah. Yes, it's and we never do the same. That's the funny thing. We've continued on the same track that you're describing 20 years ago, what was normal. We're the same. If they want their stupid ideas and stuff, fine, but just leave us out of it, please. By and large, now that will change as time goes on, obviously.
And I think that's partly where, you know, where I was saying before that the populists are more effective, is that there's a lot of the good faith has gone out of the debate, and it feels like you know, people on the centre right have shown more good faith, have shown good faith in the arguments for longer, and they've sort of said that, and that's why they've lost ground, because they've sort of presumed that the other people are, you know, they've presumed that the progressives are also acting in good faith.
Yeah.
But, you know, and maybe I'm wrong, but it feels like they are sort of like, they're more interested in demonizing. So they're not trying to argue, they're trying to demonize the opposition.
No, they're absolutely 100%. That's the sort of central theme of my life, if you like, including my novel, is that there's more to it. They're not acting in good faith. They don't even care about good faith or arguments or reason or anything. It's purely a psychological mechanism to justify their own weaknesses and failures. But we'll come up to that another time. Don't get me carried away. Yeah. Were there any influences in your, excuse me, either in your writing style in general or in you talked about The Shining and stuff, but with the influences in general towards this book and your style?
So in terms of like, I was basically, you know, bringing The Shining into a mod. It's not exactly the same. It's you know, there's enough differences, but that's where the sort of kernel of the idea started. Like, oh, what would that mean today? What would The Shining be today? And what would the horror be in the house? So that's sort of how the whole idea started. But you know, the whole idea of the sort of you know, the main character, the Anon, came because I was seeing online a lot of people, a lot of sort of like, again, I hate this term, ethnic minorities, but, you know, who were on the conservative side. So people like, I don't know if you know these people, but people like Zuby. There's a guy called Calvin Robinson, I think, who's sort of a conservative commentator in the UK. He's a father as well. He's recently become I don't know what the position is, but a significant position in Orthodox Anglicanism. And even people like, you know, Priti Patel and Suella Braverman, just anybody who was sort of a conservative and was not white, was basically getting these horrible slurs online. They were getting called house slave and worse, that's where the title of the novel comes from. It's a play on the insult house slave. And so those type of people inspired the main character. You know, I saw what they were sort of going through online and sort of what, you know, the things they were being called, and that's what inspired it. But in terms of the writing style, I was inspired by like old sort of like sci-fi. So the guy who wrote the Book of Skulls, Robert Silverberg, was a big inspiration on me. I'm inspired by a lot of American authors such as Chuck Palahniuk, although mainly Fight Club and Invisible Monsters. I'm not a big fan of a lot of his later work. But also like some of the online stuff. So a big inspiration on my style was, and people who read him might not see his influence in my work, but Delicious Tacos is this Anon online writer. And when I started reading his stuff a few years ago, I was just reading it thinking, wow, I didn't realize you could write like this. And he just writes in this very he writes auto fiction. He writes these like short blog posts, these incredibly, and I'm nowhere near like his level of honesty, but he's incredibly honest, and he sort of just tells the story through just this conversational style, like you're having a beer with him, and it's just falling out, sort of half stream of consciousness, but the language is so economical. And so to the point that it can't possibly be stream of consciousness, but it's just like a guy talking to you in a bar. And that's what I've tried to pull into my writing. I was like, okay, if Delicious Tacos did this sort of genre fiction, this sort of fantasy, horror, supernatural, what would it be like? But yeah.
Can you clarify more on? I've heard the name. I'm very familiar with the name, but I don't think I know anything about his actual writing. There's no such thing as an actual novel by him. Then it's more.
So he's done one novel, but even that is almost like in a blog post style. Most of his writing is short stories, but it's very like who knows how fictional it is, but it seems like it's just memoir.
Okay.
But also a writer I've read as well very recently. You've had him on your show, Caleb Cordell, who did The Neighbor. Yeah. I mean, he's not. He's sort of like beautiful way of playing with imagery. I mean, I'm not anywhere near what he is, but like, you know, that piece that you read about me trying to describe that sort of automatic toaster in the hotel, I was sort of trying to channel a bit of him there. And yeah, so between him and Delicious Tacos, go on.
I'm delighted to hear that. It means that there is this sort of feedback coming through. There's enough of us now, because when I started this channel maybe 3 years ago, I think it was hard to find someone to invite on the show, to be honest. There were so few. Yeah. But now we're almost getting into a kind of a network, symbiotic relationship with others. Very good.
But between him and Delicious Tacos, there's all sorts of influences, but between those two are probably the two I'm thinking about the most at the moment.
And who's Sam Pink? You mentioned him in an earlier correspondence.
So Sam Pink is a sort of, I don't know how to describe him. I think people describe him as a bit of a Zoomer writer, but he's not. He writes in this sort of, I heard about him because Delicious Tacos recommended him on a podcast, and he writes in this. He writes sort of working class fiction, this very sort of gritty, again about people lost in the sort of modern spiritualist work. And if you're going to read anything, you should read a short story by him called Ice Cream Man. He's written this wonderful collection of stories. I think it's called Ice Cream Man and Other Stories, but the Ice Cream Man is just this wonderful story about this sort of working class, sort of half-employed man who's trying to get himself back on his feet and tries to get an ice cream truck franchise and just gets like stuck in this surreal debt loop. And it's and the sort of people he meets while working in this ice cream truck, and it's just magical. And I think Delicious Tacos described him as like, from motes of dust, he creates like this huge universe. And it's like, yes, from like the dirtiest like stains on like someone's shoe, he's like creating this very visceral and relatable world. But yeah.
Where's he on Twitter as well?
He's on Twitter, but he's not very active on. You can find him on Twitter, but he's not very active. I don't think he's self-published. I think he's independently published, but he's also an illustrator. So yeah, you'd find him on Twitter under Sam Pink. I can link him to you later if you want.
And speaking of short stories, you have another published work out there called Rusalka and Other Stories. Is that right?
Yeah. So I've actually put everything. I've actually put that and House and On into sort of a new release, like a couple of weeks ago, called Bait and Switch Copy Pasta. So that's like an anthology of everything. So it's got House and On and Rusalka and Other Stories in there. And that was just 3 stories I'd written. It's about 25,000 words in total. Again, 3 sort of horror, fantasy, soft sci-fi stories. The first one, Rusalka and Other Stories, very heavily influenced by the Book of Skulls. It's about 2 guys who were sort of on a gumball rally across Europe, starting in London and trying to get to kind of Mongolia. And just as they're going through Eastern Europe and crossing the Russian border, they encounter this woman, and their plans go astray.
Is that Vox Day's book? Is it The Skulls?
The Book of Skulls is by Robert Silverberg. So it's about I think it's about the real Book of Skulls, or the real or mythological Book of Skulls. I'm not sure if it's real.
And so where are you going next in your you're obviously quite prolific, given your age especially, and you've got a job, but you're still churning them out. What's the next project?
I'm sort of about a third of the way through the first draft of a new novella. I can just give a little sneak peek into that. It's about a man who's suffering from a porn addiction, and he's sort of a functioning porn and sex addict, and he's working this corporate job, struggling to find meaning. And he gets shaken out of this world quite early in the story when his brother asks him for help, and he needs to babysit his niece and nephew for a week. And this shakes him out of this sort of routine he's got of sort of pulling girls on Tinder and, just browsing websites he shouldn't be browsing. And it breaks him out of this, and he has to sort of like help take them to school and stuff. And in the first couple of days of taking them to school, he discovers something's not right at the school. There's something evil at the school. The children are coming out of it looking scared. Children are going off sick with strange scars and wounds. And none of the parents are speaking out about it, and he doesn't know why.
Well, you got me interested already. It sounds like that.
So it's a man. So there's a kind of, again, it's kind of 2 layers. There's a man trying to fight his personal demons with this sort of behavioral addiction he's got. But there's also this real demon in the school.
And you're not going to ever write outside of the genre? I know you're a bit of a James Bond fan from following you and stuff. No chance of you pulling off a thriller at some point?
I've got this idea. The only way I'd go out of it, and it's still broadly within genre fiction, is I've got another idea that's floating around, but maybe it'll just be a short story. But it's for a sort of honey trap erotic story. So a sort of updated version of, again, I don't write anything original. I'm just copying old works and updating them. But an updated version of Lust Caution, where it's about a sort of British political donor who finds himself in a foreign honey trap.
Okay.
So that would sort of be kind of thrillerish, but I'd like I said,
it'll grow.
I do admire those works, and like I said, I was reading. I'm about 25% of the way through your book, and I went through a whole Ian Fleming phase where I read loads of them in my mid-20s and very much enjoyed them. And I enjoyed Drive, the book that the film was based on, and other thrillers, and even like westerns like No Country for Old Men and stuff like that. And so I'm not, my reading is very broad, but I just find that I just like what you can do in the sort of supernatural horror fantasy genre sort of area.
Well, very good. Well, you're very expert at it, so why not stick with it for the time being at least. Thank you very much for coming on the show, Clarke, Corporate Clarke. It's been a real pleasure. The book's a real pleasure. I highly recommend it to everybody. And I would like more writers of our ilk to do the same that you did, but maybe in other areas, because the insanity that infests our society is everywhere now. It's throughout the whole body. And whether you work in medicine or armed forces or law, I'm sure there's a similar story waiting to be written. And it makes for it's almost a release. I found a kind of relief and a release reading your novel, because it's all the tensions that build up in your normal life dealing with these idiots, and suddenly here we are. It's taken off your shoulders, if you like, and someone else is dealing with it in a very entertaining and ruthless way. Anyway, that was my penny's worth, but thank you very much for coming on, and I greatly appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Like I said, I've been watching the show before. You've had some of my favorite independent writers on, from R.J. Smith, the guy who wrote The Fall, can never remember his name. You remember the one about the weightlifting evangelist?
Yeah, Mackie, J.L. Mackie.
Yes, he's fantastic as well. So yeah, you've had. I'm just very, very flattered to be in the same company as those people. In the ranks.
Take it as written from me. Well played, mate. Very good. And thanks for coming on again. Hope to get you back in the future.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.